straight.
My lady, the next witness is Robert Harrison, if he could be sworn, please.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for coming along to help us, Ms Harrison.
You're welcome, my lady.
Mr. Harrison, you are the former Director General for Analysis in the COVID-19 Task Force.
Yes.
And you've provided a statement to the inquiry, which is INQ 000656298. Mr. Harrison, you became involved, as we understand it, in the response to COVID-19 from March of 2020 onwards.
That's right.
Initially involved in formulating a national strategy for the response of the government, is that right?
That's correct.
From April to October of 2020, you were a co-director of the International Comparators Joint Unit, which was looking at international responses, is that right?
Correct.
But from October of 2020 to February of 2022, you were the Director General for Analysis in the COVID-19 Task Force.
Yes.
And that's really the period of your involvement in the response that I want to focus on. But before we get to that period, though, and looking at your involvement generally in the government's response, is this the position that your previous roles in government had not been focused on domestic policy issues, and when you started to be involved in the COVID-19 response, you found yourself surprised, is the word you use in your witness statement, by the differences and the way in which domestic policy was being approached?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you just help us to understand what was different, what you thought was surprisingly missing, if that's appropriate?
So the thing which was most surprising to me, coming from the national security community, where there is an established practice and culture and an institution to bring together evidence in one place and present a single version of that evidence for decision makers, I was struck by the fact that on COVID and in domestic policy generally, there was no equivalent to the Joint Intelligence Committee, which is the function which performs that task for foreign policy and national security. And I recall asking people, what's the domestic equivalent of the JIC? And of course there wasn't one. Although SAGE as an emergency committee was helping to perform that function for scientific advice, there wasn't an existing institution whose role it was to bring together all of the different types of evidence and provide a single assessment of that for decision makers.
Right. And did you find that there was not an established mechanism for reaching an authoritative cross-departmental view that could then inform policy decisions?
Yes, that's correct.
And what was the consequence of the absence of that mechanism in terms of how decisions were being taken or being made by different departments?
So the consequence was that it was very difficult for decision makers to know what evidence they should be using as the basis for their decisions. It might be the case that different departmental visitors might advance a particular view supported by by some evidence, but that might be interpreted differently from how another department interpreted that evidence, and it was very difficult for ministers required to take very difficult decisions under enormous pressure of time to determine whose analysis was the right analysis. Whereas the model that I was used to would have done that work previously and presented them with what was memorably described to me by a decision maker as our best people's best guess, a common basis on which ministers could then debate what they should do and reach decisions.
So analysis is done, on a common basis, and then from that, policy decisions can be made.
That's absolutely right. And there is a clear, in the world that I'm familiar with, there is a very clear separation between those two parts of the process. And that separation was really strengthened culturally and institutionally as a result of the reports into the Iraq War, especially the Butler report of 2004. Which recommended a much clearer separation, a much more independent analytical function. And the community that I have grown up in has embedded those practices in its institutions and culture.
And so, did you find, in terms of domestic policy then, that different departments may be receiving their own internal analysis on the same issue, and that analysis may not always allied with the analysis being done by another department?
That's right. And it doesn't necessarily mean that any of that analysis is wrong, but the process requires you to test one another's conclusions and try and reach some sort of consensus on what we can say with confidence, what is not known, the amount of confidence and uncertainty that we attach to those conclusions, and then present that forward. It is very difficult to do that in the same meeting where you are trying to take the decision itself, because it is unclear what you are resting that decision on.
Right. And is that why then you say that it's important that there should be a separation between the analysis phase, which is completed and presented authoritatively, and then the decision-making phase, the policy-setting phase, based on that analysis?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, this is only my view and based on my experience, but yes, I believe that is a better system. It also requires that the people doing the assessment of those various analyses have access to all of the relevant material. But if they do, and if they then conduct a good, robust analytical process to test the various inputs and present conclusions, I think that provides ministers with the best available evidential base for their subsequent discussions.
Now, we'll come back to joint working in a while, but just to pick up on that now, you said having access to the information. Is therefore information sharing, open information sharing between departments important?
Absolutely.
Feeding into the analysis?
Essential.
And what's the problem if people aren't sharing what's going on internally in terms of analysis?
Well, the objective is to provide a single, holistic and authoritative assessment of all of the evidence which is available. So as obviously, if some of that evidence is not available to the people doing the assessment, it will be incomplete. But also, if the decision makers arrive in the room ready to take a decision with a different view on what the evidence says, then they might disagree for reasons which are connected with an assessment of the evidence rather than their judgment of what is the right thing to do. So for all of those reasons, the two-stage process and complete, the greatest possible transparency over evidence and analysis being available to the people doing that first part of the process is important.
Is there also a risk in that decision makers can be coming into the room arguing against a proposition, for example, on a basis that no one else is aware of or is able to challenge your test?
Yes, that's also true.
Right. So can we move on then to the Directorate General for Analysis in the COVID-19 Task Force? The COVID-19 Task Force, the inquiry understands, was formed in May of 2020, and it was a unit at the centre of government which was designed to join together strategy, analysis and coordination with departments across Whitehall to drive delivery. Was that your understanding of the basis on which it was established?
Yes, it was. I mean, it took a little time before it had all of those characteristics, but at the time when I arrived in it in October 2020, those were its core functions.
Yeah, and you arrived on the 19th of October as head of the Directorate General for Analysis.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, as I said in my statement, I was originally appointed to a job which was called policy and analysis, but we agreed between us to apply the separation that I have described. I gave up some of the policy areas which had been part of my predecessor's role and took on responsibility for commissioning from the scientific community so that we would institutionally apply that separation.
Okay, thank you. And the function of the Directorate General, was it firstly to provide integrated data and analysis to the Prime Minister and Cabinet to inform government decision making?
Yes, that's right. We did a certain amount of primary analysis, but generally what we were doing is assessment of data and analysis provided by other departments, bringing it together and reaching conclusions based on it, and then also presenting it in a way which was suitable for decision makers who were extremely pressed for time and also non-specialists in all of the relevant areas.
Was the idea that it would present one picture that was drawn from all the other subsets of data analysis that you'd received?
Yes.
And so that the decision makers wouldn't have to go through all those different sets of data and analysis. They get a comprehensive snapshot of the analysis and then could make their decisions.
Yes, that's right.
And did the Directorate General have multidisciplinary teams? So teams drawn from across the spectrum: health, science, economics, behaviour, social public policy, those sorts of things?
Yes, that's right. I think all of the ones that you mentioned, I think some others, we had a long-range foresight function to try and take a longer view out several months or even beyond the end of the pandemic. I'm trying to think what else there was. I think we had a number of sort of functional teams who were responsible for creating the data products, setting up the data pipelines, processing, exchanging data with other departments. That was also indispensable. And what we've described there are the characteristics of the sub-teams, but I think I should also mention that the human beings in that organisation were a very rich mixture, probably from 30 or 40 different departments or non-departmental bodies, agencies, and so on.
Was that a good thing, having that rich mix of people?
I thought so.
Yeah. And what were the benefits of bringing all those people together into your unit?
It meant that we had people who understood the specialisms which existed in other departments. It meant that people came at the problem from different perspectives because of their previous professional background. It made it quite easy to create a culture of challenge. I don't think there were any downsides. It was partly done by design and partly by accident, because the way that the task force grew was by asking for help from other departments, a certain amount of direct recruitment. People often volunteered to join, so it wasn't. It was not built according to a blueprint. It was created out of the various people who came together as the Directorate General for Analysis was formed from its predecessor sort of groups.
That capacity for internal challenge that was brought from the fact there were people coming together from all sorts of different backgrounds, was that important, that the challenge was done internally before the analysis was prepared?
Yes, or in the course of preparing
Yes.
analysis and assessment. Yes, it really was. And I think there were two things that really helped us. One was that the model that I have described, which I was trying to apply to this problem, was one which had explicitly, the Butler report and the Chilcot report later had explicitly highlighted the risks of groupthink, and that community had developed analytical methods or analytical tradecraft to test conclusions aggressively to try and identify assumptions that were being made, or to try and mitigate that risk of groupthink. That was one. And then the other was that the scientific community have a very robust culture of challenge. The method is to advance a proposition and then and test it. I've mentioned in my statement that we adopted a practice which I first heard about in SPI-M, which was a sort of mantra of tell me why I'm wrong. I advance my analysis, and then I invite you to tell me why I've made a mistake, and really, try hard to prove me wrong, and that if it survives that trial, it will be the conclusions will be stronger. And we tried to embed that type of culture across my team and the analytical community within government.
And was that all designed to ensure that the analysis that was ultimately presented was as robust as it possibly could be and really represented a single voice of the evidence, everything having been assessed, argued internally as the analysis was developed?
Yes. It both improved the quality of the analysis and improved the confidence that a range of departments with different views might have in it, because they had the opportunity to debate and test and challenge one another on assumptions that they might be making.
I want to move on slightly to how you coordinated this analytical effort. Did you and your team, when you were stood up, have a general concern that policy was not being sufficiently evidence-driven?
Yes, that was certainly a concern.
And was that, I mean, the way you put it was that policy was developed by triangulating between a number of considerations, of which the evidence was one.
Yes, and that is meant to be descriptive and not critical.
No, of course.
But yes, that is my impression of how people were trying to take account of evidence in the development of policy, without the sort of institutional rules of the road that I was used to and didn't exist perhaps in other parts of government.
And did you also consider that it appeared to you, at least, that scientific advice was really being commissioned piecemeal by different policy teams, and it was difficult to integrate it into a definitive analysis?
Yes, it was. So it was being the commissioning was slightly chaotic, and it was often at quite short notice, and a number of different departments would go to the same providers asking for slightly overlapping demands. So it was very difficult for the people doing that work to understand what government's top priorities were with enough advance notice to be able to do high quality work.
And so to understand what you were trying to change, you sent an email to your senior team on the 27th of October 2020. I just want to pick up on some of the things you said in that you should retain, firstly, a single page of key judgments. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And why have a single page of key judgments in that way?
So that was a practice, again, that I brought from my previous job and previous experience, that recognising that decision makers were very pressed for time, they needed the analysis to be summarised at a manageable length, and that we should test ourselves, challenge ourselves to summarise the things that we wanted to say on a single page, and then provide more detail, additional layers of detail for those that wanted to go further. And again, the practice that I was familiar with used those key judgments as the sort of foundations for policy. So we wanted people to be able to say, the analytical community has reached this judgment, and therefore, your options are as follows.
Yeah. And you were also keen that there should be confidence statements with your analysis. So in other words, a way of communicating there's uncertainty here, or this is the strength of the evidence base for the analysis. Is that right?
That's right. That's, again, a really important part of analytical practice and tradecraft. One is to talk about probability, and the other is to talk about confidence, and to reflect accurately the strength or weakness of the evidential base for the judgments that you're reaching.
And then the third thing you picked up in that email was that there should not be, in the analysis, policy recommendations.
Yes.
And just explain why you wouldn't make a policy recommendation alongside the analysis.
So that, I suppose, is that's the Chinese wall that I was talking about earlier between analysis and policy. It can be very difficult after you've done the analysis to stop yourself from going straight into recommendations, but it is I suppose, a definition of roles. The analytical community might well participate in discussions about what to do, but that is not their core task. Their core task is just to describe as objectively as possible what the evidence says, and that is then the end of their function. Another team will then develop options for ministers, and ministers are responsible for taking the decisions.
So forgive me, I thought you said earlier that you do the analysis and then you tell people what the options are. I
beg your pardon, my lady. So no, you do the analysis, you reach the judgments as best you can on what the evidence says. That's the end of the analytical part of the cycle.
Yep.
Your policy colleagues would then take that and also various other inputs, including the ministerial steers which they might have had, and they'll develop policy options for ministers, and the options will then be put to the ministers for decision. That would be.
So your earlier comment basically combined the two teams, the analytical part, and then others develop the options.
That's right, yes, exactly.
Thank you.
So within the task force, typically, the analytical team would present the conclusions, pass it on to the policy and strategy team who would write the papers laying out for ministers what their options are, referring to the evidence summarised in our analysis.
So just to complete that, then the two things would go together into this one-page judgment. Here's the analysis, here's the option.
No, I beg your pardon, I am being
I think that was the question that Ladyship was driving at.
So the key judgments or key insights that I'm talking about would be the final conclusions from the analytical part of the process. And they could then be written into policy papers. They might be presented as an annex to the policy papers, but those are they're the terminal point of the analytical part of the process.
Thank you. I have it.
Thank you. Now, I accept there's an element of me asking you to mark your own homework here, but I mean, how successful do you think that approach was as you implemented it in the autumn of 2020 going forwards?
So I think it took us some time, honestly. At that particular moment, it was a very difficult point in the pandemic response. You will know that we were, I think it was in my second week that we went into the second lockdown. While we were trying to develop this slightly different way of working, daily demands on the teams and everybody in them continued. And a number of these cultural changes were quite different to the way that many officials were used to working, and it wasn't natural. So there was quite.
Sorry, can I just jump in there? Can you just expand on that? What was the cultural barrier to that way of working, if you like?
So, one we've already described, which is the sort of this very clear separation that I have described, which is practice in the national security community, is not common practice in the rest of government, and it requires, it requires a bit of learning and calibration. And then I think that most analysts in domestic departments would say that they don't feel that they are peers with their policy colleagues, that they are rather service providers. And one of the things that I was trying to do was to encourage them to be more independent and assertive with their policy colleagues. And when you're being more independent and assertive at a time when everybody is under pressure, it causes a bit of grinding of the gears. And it genuinely took some time. Also, many of the parts of the process that I've described all had to be set up from scratch. So we had to establish what was going to be our core products. How are we going to present the conclusions? The availability of data had improved significantly, but was not perfect. There was no existing institution where departments would come together and debate analytical conclusions, as there was with the Joint Intelligence Committee, and there was no institution that would be understood by all departments to carry authority, for its judgments to carry authority. So all of that had to be built.
Yeah. I'm sorry to cut in, but I'm obviously want to cover quite a lot of ground with you. So can we look at how you built that? I think you set up the Heads of Analysis Group in November of 2020, is that right?
Yes.
And the Heads of Analysis Group brought together representatives from the Treasury, Office for National Statistics, Department of Health, scientific advice, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And you described that as having a central objective to help align the analytical effort across government, is that right?
Yes.
And there were weekly meetings of these analytical units from across government to try and coordinate analysis, is that right?
That's right. We had a senior meeting every week, or at times of lower pressure, maybe every 2 weeks, and we had working level meetings, often daily, to make sure that the analytical effort remained aligned.
Thank you. And you were moving to a model that brought the SAGE advice within the analysis of economic and societal factors, is that right?
That's right. What we were trying to understand is what would be most useful to policymakers and decision makers to identify the questions that they would need answered to be able to take good decisions, and then to commission centrally sources of data, sources of scientific advice, analysis in other departments, with sufficient notice for that to be done to a high standard, and also then pass through a process which would allow us to debate and reach collective judgments.
And you described it as trying to create a high trust analytical bubble, is that right?
Yes.
So high trust as in those making the decisions can trust the analysis.
So I actually meant something slightly different.
Well, you tell us what you meant. It's your
So
phrase.
again, one of the things which I noted was a difference between the environment that I was used to and the environment that I was in was that levels of trust were lower. And I think that was very evident during the autumn of 2020. Some of the evidence of lack of trust between the political community and the scientific advisors was evident in the press. And in a low trust environment, it's very difficult to share freely and debate conclusions in the way that I've described. So what I tried to help institute was what we described as the analytical bubble, where we would create a high trust bubble within maybe a lower trust environment. And we agreed with analysts from other departments and the scientific community that within that bubble, we would debate everything freely. We'd share everything and it would be entirely open. But we would not share outside that bubble until we had reached our conclusions and we were able to present those conclusions to all departments and to ministers collectively. So it was trying to create an environment in which a greater degree of freedom to share was possible.
I see. So it's trust internally, essentially, that everyone within the bubble is encouraged to share their views, debate, contribute.
Yes. And a really important part was on the part of the Cabinet Office team was to tell analysts and advisors outside government what the government was trying to achieve and what options were and weren't plausible. So that was obviously potentially very sensitive. If it had leaked, it would have been very damaging. It would have been certainly very damaging for the type of model that I was trying to create. But I felt that it was important that everybody who was trying to advise the government understood what it was trying to do, and that if we were clear that we were sharing in confidence for that purpose, we would, nothing would leak. And I don't recall any significant leaks from within that analytical bubble.
And did those steps, some of which you've just outlined for us, did they improve, in your view, the quality of the output from the Directorate General of Analysis?
Yes, I think they did, but I do think it took a little bit of time. The experience of the autumn of 2020 was very difficult indeed because of the external pressures and because the demands on everybody were so great. It was difficult to create enough space to build an alternative model. But I think through December, January and February, leading to the publication of the roadmap out of lockdown, we got to a very much better position where we were able to develop policy and inform decision-making on the basis of much higher quality analytical output.
A phrase you've used in your witness statement was that it became a virtuous circle.
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
So The model that I've described required changes on the analytical side, but it involved a really significant change with our policy colleagues, who deserve just as much credit for how they worked with the analytical community. It required them to think a little bit further ahead about what they were going to need, accept that it would take longer than they were used to for analysts to provide work, accept that this principle of analytical independence, which again was not strictly, was not a cultural norm at that time. But what I found was that as our analysis became better, and as it was better informed by an understanding of what the government was trying to achieve, we were able to produce stuff which was better and more useful. And as it became better and more useful, policy colleagues became more and more dependent on, not dependent on it, but relied more and more on it, as ultimately did decision makers. And that is the virtuous circle that I was referring to in my statement.
Okay, thank you. And you developed a number of different products, if you like. Is that right? That would be presented depending on what it was you were being asked to do?
Yes, absolutely.
So there were analytical products that you were producing. They were to support policy development and decision making.
Yes.
So, for example, you might have products summarising the evidence at key decision points.
Yes.
You might have long-form, in-depth documents.
Yes.
Or you might have short-form spotlight documents that were, as they say, a short-form presentation, a snapshot presentation.
Yes, on a single piece of paper.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to ask. We just put up one of these spotlights as an example. This is INQ 000625666. And this is a spotlight on the impact of the pandemic on the economy from the 3rd of March of 2021. Is that right?
That's right.
And is this a typical example of the sort of spotlights you're producing?
That's a typical format, usually one page of text and some visualizations to follow.
Yeah.
And the confidence statement, as we've discussed.
Yeah. So that, if we just go to the first page, that in a single page sets out the snapshot, if you like, the spotlight on the issue.
Yes.
There is at the bottom there a comment about widespread uncertainty and so on and so forth, a caveat, if you like.
So that's not so much a caveat. That's usually, so the format of these is a chunk in bold at the top, bottom line up front, which is if you read nothing else, read this.
Right.
4 or 5 points, and then the opportunity for the analyst to say what they think about it and why it might be useful, or so what, if you like.
Okay. So if we look at the top part there, that's in bold. That's if you're going to read anything, read this.
Yes.
And we see that the pandemic and associated MPIs have driven the deepest recession in 3 centuries. Been a significant economic disruption. It goes on after a partial recovery during the summer. Tighter restrictions and ongoing uncertainty are suppressing economic activity. And then on the last page, we'll just go to that just to pick up on that. So page 3, yeah, we've got the confidence statement. And would these always be based on the same scale so that people began to know what they were looking at?
Yes, that was a scale from high to low, color-coded, and some explanatory comments.
Yeah.
And the source documents referenced, as you can see in the section above.
Okay, thank you. So that's a good example of a spotlight. You were also producing scenario documents where you would set out a range of plausible future scenarios. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
And then also producing papers that were designed to challenge consensus. Could you just expand a little on that and explain what you mean by that?
Yes. So obviously we did a lot of work two commissions from policy colleagues or from ministers, but we also wanted to be able to flag things that we thought were important that might not get the attention that they needed because people were focused on one particular part of the problem. So I think I've mentioned in my statement one or two examples. One that I recall very well was a concern that because our principal concern was NHS capacity, we were generally focused on hospital admissions as what I've described as the objective function. But of course, getting COVID was itself a bad thing, even if it didn't take you to hospital. It increased the risks of long COVID. It increased the risks of workforce absences. You know, the various negative things associated with infection, short of hospitalisation, and we wanted to make sure, as the government considered how it was going to open up, that those things were also considered, bearing in mind that by that stage we were opening up with quite a well-vaccinated or high levels of immunity in the population. We thought it was nevertheless important to bear in mind that what was described, I think, as mild to moderate sickness was still extremely unpleasant and potentially had risks attached. So that was one example that I recall.
So was there an element of free thinking then in the unit in terms of producing those, that these weren't things you're being tasked to do, but things that were considered to be important and that you thought you ought to produce
Yes, we felt that it was part of our role to flag things that busy people might not have thought of, but we thought were nevertheless important. So, as I say, a lot of our work was done to commissions for particular decision points or other key moments, but quite a lot of our output, and especially the spotlights, were often used to sort of, have you thought of this? This is an important thing. Maybe that would then provide the hook for a conversation with our policy colleagues about whether that thing needed a bit more time and attention and whether we needed to make any adjustments.
Thank you. So those were the analytical products. You were also producing data products. Now, these tended to be a visualization of data with little or no interpretation or analysis. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And they were things like the COVID-19 dashboard, the automated daily data brief, and data packs for COVID-0 meetings.
Yes, and the slides that people will be familiar with from the press conferences.
Yeah. Now, as you've told us, you were working across government, and I think you've already touched on this, that you would receive data and analysis that had been done by other departments, and then you would look to produce a sort of consensus view.
Yes, that's generally true. We would occasionally do some primary analysis ourselves, but often what we were doing is using inputs from others.
So the relationship with those individual departments was important.
Yes.
So can I concentrate now on the next topic, on the relationship with the Treasury?
Yes.
And I think your principal point of liaison in the Treasury was James Benford, who was the director of the Economics Group. Is that right?
That's right.
And in terms of the composition of your Directorate General, you had a significant number of staff working for you who had Treasury experience. Either they were loaned by the Treasury to you or they had worked there. Is that right?
That's right.
And you say in your statement that the Treasury did participate actively in cross-departmental analytical efforts. Is that right?
That's right. I think what I've said in the statement is that it was a mixed picture, but the best analysis that we did, the best and most balanced analysis, was produced when the Treasury were most involved.
Yeah. And you describe them as often the source of valuable challenge.
Yes.
But you say it was a mixed picture. I mean, it wasn't always an easy relationship. Is that fair?
That is fair.
You put it diplomatically in your statement that tensions arose but were managed.
So, yes, and I think that was all part of the good news story. I mean, tensions were good and healthy. I mentioned James Benford by name. He was very often a particularly valuable source of challenge in an analytical community in which people from the Department of Health and its associated bodies were preponderant, and that challenge was extremely valuable.
Yeah. And I'm just going to put up an email, INQ 000625696, please. This was from you to James Benford, 23rd February 2021. The voice of the evidence is loud in the document. This depended on a huge collective effort across the analytical community to reach a consensus position. I think you've had one of the hardest jobs as an often lonely voice. Your challenge, always courteous and constructive, has undoubtedly made the final product better. I'm hugely grateful to the Treasury team and to you for your leadership role. Having the Treasury fully on board has been a game changer. And so, fully on board, why was it important that the Treasury, and we're focusing now on economic analysis that you were doing, why was it important that the Treasury was fully on board, and what did you mean by fully on board?
So it was important because we were trying to present decision makers with a balanced picture which took into account all of the factors that they needed to consider in taking a decision. Obviously, the impact on the nation's health was one. The impact on the economy was right behind that, and the range of impacts on our country and society also needed to be taken into account to be able to provide them with a balanced view. It's almost impossible to do that without input from one of the most powerful and important departments in Whitehall and the principal department responsible for management of the economy. So their involvement was indispensable in our ability to provide good advice to ministers on their choices around how to unlock after that third lockdown.
Okay. I'm going to ask that part of your statements put up on the screen now. This is page 36 of the statement. It's paragraph 124, I think. And I just want to pick up on this paragraph. You say this, having described the importance of the Treasury to your work. The Treasury found transparency uncomfortable. It was less open than other departments and demanded a level of transparency from others which it did not always reciprocate. This caused irritation amongst others in the analytical community. Now, you described earlier that relations were mixed. Is that part of what you were?
That's part of the mix.
Yeah.
Is that because Treasury is always concerned about leakage of policy affecting markets?
So I'm not sure, my lady. I've never worked inside the Treasury, but I think that was certainly one of the relevant considerations. And in preparing for today, but after writing my statement, I read a number of the witness statements of the Treasury officials, and that is a line which many of them take, that market-sensitive information needs to be protected, and it is not always appropriate to share outside the Treasury, and that Treasury ministers should take the decision on whether it is in fact shared.
But from your perspective, leading this team, you had tried to create this high-trust analytical bubble where confidentiality was respected and nothing was being leaked. So would it have assisted you if there was greater transparency and greater sharing from the Treasury?
Yes, it would certainly have assisted. A number of the other things that we were talking about within that analytical bubble were also extremely sensitive, including sensitive for markets, because some of the options that the government was having to consider had really significant economic effects. But I can say from my previous experience that the government is capable of keeping secrets, and high trust communities are able to work on sensitive material in the national interest without it necessarily leaking directly to the press. So I understand the Treasury arguments, and I really understand how before, for example, a major fiscal event, it might be necessary for those, the supporting analysis to be retained internally, but
And not published.
not published.
It's delivered.
No. But I think that particular reason is over-egged as a reason not to share economic analysis, or at least the methodology for that analysis, freely outside the department.
Well, can I pick up on that about methodology? You say in your statement that economic modelling, and you're dependent to a large extent in your unit on the modelling that the Treasury has done. It's feeding into you, yes?
Yes.
That economic modelling was not as transparent in your view, or as robust as other types of modelling. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
Yes. So maybe I should say, from my perspective, it was not as transparent. But my reference point was the transparency that operated in the epidemiological modelling community, where I was able to ask any question that I wanted, understand the methodology behind it, attend meetings with the modellers, ask them any questions, see the data on which the models were based, ask them about their assumptions, see those conclusions published as soon as possible after a decision so that they could be debated, including by the general public. I thought it was a very high standard of transparency, and I did not see any comparable process with economic modelling, where I often struggled to get hold of the modelling itself and the methodology behind it, and relied on conclusions which were presented to me by colleagues in the Treasury. This isn't always the case, but that was the general picture.
So just to unpack that a little, you found in other instances that the conclusion would be shared with you and the modelling would be made transparent so you could understand it, but that the Treasury would share the conclusion but not tell you the detail of the modelling?
Yes, the latter. So the latter was more common, that the conclusion would be presented, and sometimes it would be explained, but I often was asking for the actual model or the spreadsheet which had been used to reach conclusions which we were going to include in one of our products. And
why was it important that you had and could see the modelling that supported a conclusion?
So I suppose for two reasons. One is, as I've described, the process of reaching judgments in which you can have confidence involves testing all of the propositions and the process which has led to those propositions being advanced. And secondly, transparency is an analytical standard. The government's best practice for analysis, in fact, published by the Treasury in the Aqua Book, requires that you are able to cite the underlying analysis in any product. And for a team whose role it was to synthesize and make assessments across other people's work before putting forward their conclusions, and you wanted to be able to have confidence in them and then be able to reference them accurately.
Do you have confidence even now that you were aware of all of the modelling that the Treasury was doing at the time?
No, I don't think so. And since submitting my statement and reading the other Treasury statements, I saw one thing which genuinely surprised me, which was the existence of an EPI macro model developed inside the Treasury by the Treasury during the summer of 2020. That's the first time I have ever heard about that. And I checked with some former colleagues before appearing here today. That is a, as I say, a genuine surprise. It is absolutely the sort of thing that I would have expected to be shared outside the department and made available so that it could be tested. And with other models that were put to us from elsewhere, I mentioned, for example, one commercial model which reached number 10. We had a process by which we would then seek expert views on whether that model was robust, the purposes for which it might be appropriate, any caveats which might be placed on it. And I can't say very much more than I was very surprised to find that in the course of preparing for today.
Okay. I think what you're referring to is in the statement of Beth Russell. So I'll ask that to put up. It's INQ 000588 226. paragraph 335. In the summer of 2020, the Treasury developed a new epi-macro modelling and analysis for autumn and winter planning. It sets that out.
Yes.
So you were unaware that the Treasury was doing that modelling?
I was
at the
unaware.
time? And would you have expected to know that?
Yes.
In the spirit of openness and
Yes,
collaboration?
I would have expected to know of its existence, and as soon as I knew of its existence, I would have expected it to have been shared, the methodology to have been shared, and I would have expected the EPI components to have been quality assured by the government's epidemiological experts in the way that we did with other models.
And if there was that model and you'd been able to do that quality of assurance, would that have generally assisted you in the Directorate General of Analysis in terms of providing economic analysis?
Well, it depends. As you'll have seen from my statement, I'm still not yet I have not yet seen an epi-macro model that would have been something that we could have used with confidence during the course of the pandemic. I'm not hostile to the idea. I understand its utility, but I never saw one which was sufficiently robust to support government decision making, and more than one would have been required because it was a principle of SPI-M which I thought was a very sound one, that no single model could ever be relied on, and that you needed the outputs of several models debated by experts who understood them to reach conclusions which would be useful.
But does this also, the fact that there appears to have been a model you were unaware of, does that go back to the point you made earlier, that it's back to this problem of if that modelling has been shared internally, say with decision makers in the Treasury, they're going into meetings about policy with modelling and analysis that no one else knows about, no one else has been able to quality assure or check or challenge?
Yes.
And just to pick up on modelling, I just want to deal with this briefly if we can. You developed an economic toy model, is that right? Not you personally, but
no,
what had been developed?
We had the word model can be used to describe everything from a very, very simple spreadsheet to a very elaborate epidemiological model. This was a very simple thing. I would prefer to describe it as a tool which allowed us, by local authority area, to say if restrictions apply across these local authorities, the amount of gross value added will be, under those restrictions, will be this proportion of the nation's output. So it was not it was not seeking to model the economic impact. It was descriptive, so that ministers could see that, what proportion of the country was affected by a particular measure.
Right, so it's a simplistic thing, but did you find that the Treasury were then running with that and using it in a way that it, as far as you were concerned, hadn't been intended to be used?
So that was something slightly different. So that was the toy model which I refer to in my statement and about which I was asked was an epidemiological toy model. So because there were real attractions in simple models and there were a number flying around, we thought that it was a sensible thing to do to create one within government in which we had confidence with proper caveats on use, and then make that available so that people could not absolutely not to inform decisions, but to help people who might be unfamiliar with the concepts understand how, for example, vaccine rollout at different speeds might affect the path of the virus, at least directionally. So the principal developers were the Joint Biosecurity Centre, we worked with them, so too did the Treasury, to try and develop this thing called the toy model. I think at one stage we had an aspiration to try and develop something similar, an economic toy model, but I don't remember whether the thing that I have described, this descriptive tool to inform ministers what proportion of the country was under restrictions, was ever developed into something which was comparable to the JBC toy model.
Right. Okay. Just want to move on slightly to a linked point about the Treasury not being willing to share an analysis. I'll just take an example of working from home, October, November 2021. The task force produced a draft spotlight that included Treasury estimates of the cost of working from home. I'll ask if that's put up. It's INQ 00625672. Yeah, and we see there HMT estimates estimates that mandating working from home could increase this impact by additional 11 to 18 billion per annum. Did you ask the Treasury for their analysis and the assumptions on which they base those figures?
Yes, absolutely. It's obviously a headline-grabbing figure. In fact, quite literally, because those figures were published by Politico, sourced to an internal Treasury document, not actually citing it quite correctly. But we absolutely needed to have confidence that we understood the workings that had produced those figures before we could allow them to go to decision making.
So this is a draft.
This is a draft.
You're wanting to know, what have you based that figure on?
Yes.
And is it the position that the Treasury refused to share that with you?
Yes, I mean, that is the short answer. And we had a fair bit of toing and froing over this. And I spoke on this occasion to Claire Lombardelli as the Chief Economic Advisor about this particular issue. And she was able to share me some commentary, but not the workings for those figures. So I wrote back to her to say, without the workings, I didn't feel that we were able to include that figure and that we couldn't stand behind it with confidence, and removed it from the from that product.
So the spooking the markets argument doesn't fly there because the figure had already been leaked, and you were just wanting the working.
Yes, and I mean, I suppose so. Yeah, yes, my lady, absolutely. It does show that there is a risk of sensitive information being leaked, but it hadn't leaked from within this analytical bubble, and it had leaked incorrectly because, as I recall, the figures were included as the cost of working from home would be this, without mentioning that it was per annum. So it was a sensationalist leak, but it underlines the importance of being able to of understanding how such headline-grabbing figures have been arrived at.
Yeah, and you expressed your frustration, I think, about that in an email to colleagues. If we could have that up, INQ 00625684. You say that HMT have refused to share the analysis supporting the figures below and now backed away from quantifying the effect. And they've instead shared a note which draws qualitative conclusions. And you say this in the middle there, this is frustrating. Not a totally unreasonable analytical position given high levels of uncertainty. And you go on to say at the bottom, this means at present there are no figures which either we or HMT are able to stand behind. 11 to 18 billion should be struck from the record.
That's right. So I do think it's worth underlining what I said about it not being an unreasonable analytical position. If the uncertainty is very high, perhaps we can't produce meaningful figures for ministers. We can just say qualitatively that this is the option which is going to cause most economic damage, as well as having the highest impact on transmission.
You didn't mean it wasn't an unreasonable analytical position to refuse to share it with you?
No, I think that in the model that I was describing, that would be an unreasonable thing to do. If you send a conclusion, you need to be willing to share the workings to support it. But I have just had in my mind, as I've been talking, it would be fair to say that that is not common practice, and that the sort of model that we were trying to develop is not one with which most domestic officials would be familiar. I thought it was very striking, the consistency in the Treasury statements about it being a matter for minister to decide what is shared outside the department. And I think it's fair of me to acknowledge that most people would think that was an entirely reasonable position, and that would be common practice. So it was not in line with what we were trying to do, but I don't think that they can, I don't think that the individuals who were, if people were put in a position where they were being asked to share with the Cabinet Office analysis which a Treasury Minister had decided should not be shared, it obviously put them in a very difficult position.
Yeah. No, understood. What you're saying is that their position really reflected what you might call default ways of working in government.
Yes.
That the minister decides what is and isn't shared.
Yes, exactly.
But what you were doing in your Directorate General was trying to encourage a new way of working.
Yes.
And so there was a tension between those two
Absolutely,
things.
and it was across the grain of the way that Whitehall is used to working.
Yeah, it didn't sit easily with usual business as usual in Whitehall.
Yes.
Right. I think there were other issues with the Treasury also not being willing to have their analysis, which has informed your documents, described as their analysis. Is that right?
That's right.
And this blew up, for example, with workforce absences in January 2022 is an example of that. And I'll just ask, please, that we put up INQ 000625 page 3 of that, I think it is. 625693. And we see there at the top, this is from the Treasury to you, references to HMT analysis have reappeared in this slide pack. Per our previous comments, this should only be referenced as internal analysis. So they didn't want it being presented as Treasury analysis.
That's right.
How did that sit with you?
So, so that was not in line with analytical best practice as we were trying to enforce it. It's not in line with the Aquabook guidance on analysis being sourced and referenced. So it's something that I think we sought to challenge.
I mean, I think ultimately you were trying to manage relationships. Is that right?
It was absolutely. I was, and I provided examples to illustrate some of the friction. But the point that I made earlier is really important. We were only able to do our job with the Treasury Cooperative, and I recognised that, as I've just said, sometimes the individuals within the Treasury were in difficult positions and subject to conflicting pressures, and I can say that the best work that we did was not possible, would not have been possible without their active cooperation. So I did understand it, but I also felt it was my job to be enforcing standards across the analytical community, partly for reasons of analytical propriety, but also for reasons of fairness, because it was a source of friction with other departments that if rules were seen to apply to one department but not to another.
Yeah. So is this a fair summary that the Treasury did cooperate with you extensively, and you couldn't have achieved a lot of the analysis you did on economic issues without the Treasury? You would have preferred absolute optimal level cooperation, which didn't always occur, but that was largely, in your view, based on historical culture in government, and you were trying to implement a new way of working, a new way of thinking.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Can I then use that too in the time we have left, because I want to give you an opportunity to speak about the future and look forwards based on your experience. Turn to recommendations that you pick up on in your statement, but just to found those with the fact that the inquiry understands that there has been established a joint data and analysis centre established in March 2022 in the Cabinet Office. Is that right?
That is correct.
And is that centre, or was it established to really take forward the work that you've been doing in the Directorate General of Analysis?
Yes. During the course of 2021, we wrote a number of papers to say there was a gap, we filled it, we should keep the thing that we've built and use it for other problems. That was the basic proposition. And the result of that was Joint Data and Analysis Centre, which is still in existence.
Is it in existence in a format, as far as you're aware, or at a level where you think it should be or needs to be?
No, it isn't. So compared with the recommendations that I originally put forward, it's somewhat smaller. The COVID analytical team was about 100 to 130, depending on the time. I recommended a unit of about 160, scaled to the requirements which were put to me. As of today, I believe that JDAC comprises about 35 people. But really, it's not the scale that is the most important thing. What I am really advocating is the model that I have described today, which was developed in another part of government, refined and improved on the basis of very hard learning, and then applied to the COVID problem with positive effect. I'm suggesting that model and that culture is applied. So JDAC does not have the level of independence which I recommended, or that the Joint Intelligence Organisation has. I don't think that its authority to reach judgments across Whitehall it would be recognised in the same way, and I don't think it has the power to require other departments to share their data and analysis in the way that I have described that I believe is important.
So let's pick up on some of those issues. How can it have that greater independence and authority?
So I recommended that it, rather than existing as a subordinate team within a policy unit, which is where it currently sits, within something called the Economic and Domestic Secretariat, that it should be created as a self-standing unit within the Cabinet Secretariat, the part of the Cabinet Office that supports the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, in the same way as the Joint Intelligence Organisation works alongside its policy counterpart, but is independent of it. And what I'm proposing is an institutional separation of analysis and policy to match the procedural separation that I've described earlier. It's also important that the head of that unit is seen by senior officials across Whitehall to be an authority, to have convening power, and for a body chaired by that official to be recognised as the place where we reach single authoritative judgments on which ministers can collectively rely.
And collectively rely, you say that the numbers have fallen. We won't get into debate on how many numbers you need at any given time, but collectively rely just in times of emergency, or in your view, is there benefit to government in ordinary times from having a unit with that independence and capability?
I believe that it's absolutely essential in ordinary times. And I'm not the only person who thinks that. It has been highlighted as a gap in the government machinery for many years by parliamentary committees and by others such as the Institute for Government.
Yeah. And the power to access data and analysis, how do you suggest that should be bestowed on that body?
So I suppose that needs agreement from ministers collectively, that they recognise that whereas they might sometimes wish that certain analysis is not shared outside their department, that the government works best when it is able to rest on the very best available assessment of the available evidence, and that there is an expectation that data and analysis will be shared and then appropriately protected. As I say, government can do that. It is a significant cultural change. to the way that ministerial authority and responsibility usually operates, but I see no reason why it can't be done, not least because it does operate that way in the foreign policy and national security community.
Given the limited resources available to government, probably Cabinet Office at the moment, any recommendation I make, I have always to be careful that it's not something that's completely and utterly unaffordable, otherwise nothing's going to happen. Roughly, what do you think it would cost to have the kind of unit that you're talking about? And is there any way that that could save money in usual times?
So, my lady, I think I'm trying to look from the
I think
paper of my
16
recommendation.
to 18 million was. So I think I have a figure of 18 million in my head.
It might have been a little bit more than that. I will try and find you the number. What I would say is that, so first of all, the number isn't the most important thing. The Cabinet Office is quite a large department, and the difference between the unit as it currently exists and the unit as recommended is only perhaps 100 analysts. So within a large department, if it chose to, those things could be adjusted. So it could be move people around within the department or have people with different skills. I do believe that analytical skills are something which government and the civil service are going to need in abundance if we are going to be able to deal with the challenges of the century that faces us. But the most important part of my recommendation, my lady, is free. It is to do with how the institutions work together and the expectations that they will work together to reach a common conclusion, because there are many thousands of analysts within the government, and this is a way of enabling them to work more effectively together. So even if there were not a single penny for a single additional analyst, the rest of the recommendations around independence and having a single authority all stand. And as I say, they're not just views. They are, I think, empirically proven to have led to better decision making in the second half of the pandemic than the first, and have been long tried and tested in another part of the jungle.
18.2 million.
18.2 million. Thank you.
Can I just pick up on one other question? The Joint Data and Analysis Centre, it's performing analysis, sometimes based on other analysis and data. Does it have a power to direct which data should be gathered and how? And if it doesn't, should it have?
So I wouldn't necessarily just. So first of all, I should say I am not absolutely up to date. After the end of my time on COVID, I went to go and work on a different crisis and haven't followed how all of this has sort of played out since. They certainly have the power to commission, and one of the most important things is to be having an entity at the centre of government which is anticipating what government is going to need, and then making sure that it is connected to data sources elsewhere that might be useful, and if there are gaps, commissions new data sources. So in normal times, it's not so much the power as the having a function whose job it is to anticipate what government is going to need. I honestly don't know what is the current basis of cooperation with other departments and whether some of the things that I've described have been slightly overtaken by events, but I don't believe that to be the case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harrison. Those are my questions. Melody, I think there is one.
There is. It's BT, who's just there.
Thank you. Mr. Harrison, I asked some questions on behalf of National Disabled People's Organisations. In your statement, you explain that you worked extensively with people outside government, including academics on SAGE and its subgroups, 2 expert advisory groups, and others who, in fact, had no formal advisory relationship with government. And that was to explore whether they had analytical tools, models or other approaches from which you might benefit in your work. Did that consultation, which sounds like it was fairly extensive, include any consultation with disabled people's organisations, being organisations that are majority-led, staffed and governed by disabled people as distinct from charities, or disabled people?
So I suppose I should answer your question in two parts. The first is whether any of the formal advisory groups considered and represented the interests of disabled people, and the other is whether in my own slightly magpie-like searching for things that might be useful, I had any contact with disabled groups. So on the latter, the answer is no, I didn't. I was monitoring, in addition to things which were coming at me, some of the analysis which was being done by members of the general public or other organisations and circulated on Twitter based on government data. But I don't remember seeing anything produced by a group representing disabled people which I saw and thought that's really useful, we should bring it inside government. What I can say is that one of the issues which we as an analytical community focused on consistently was the impact on groups who might suffer cumulative disadvantage as a result of the pandemic and the government's responses to it, focusing particularly on those people who might be affected by all of the negative effects of infection, serious ill health, long-term ill health, economic deprivation, and so on and so on. And I do recall that disabled people featured as one of the constituencies that might have suffered from those cumulative impacts. And we did our best in our analytical products to represent that to decision makers.
And I think on that cumulative impact, and yes, in your statement you've referred, for example, to some of the analytical tools looking at that. I think you were able to consult sources such as the ONS and the Public Health England.
Yes.
And you've described already in your evidence the benefits of having a rich data picture and a mix of sources and perspectives, and how that improved the quality of the analysis that you were able to do. Would that analysis, do you think, have benefited from input from representative organisations who would have had, whether it was qualitative or quantitative sources of data and perspectives to contribute to supplement those other sources?
So I'm sure that it would have done. And wherever we engaged with a group that was taking a different analytical approach, it was always valuable, and we did our best to consider whether it was something which we then wanted to bring inside the analysis that we were doing within government, and sometimes we did and sometimes we didn't. And I don't think that there was any particular reason why in this occasion we didn't. The reason was I didn't come across an analysis which sparked my interest, so that we had taken the opportunity to follow up. And if an infinite amount of time it has existed, we might have had a more systematic approach of outreach to groups and to individuals who might have other approaches. So we tried to seek the widest possible range, but by no means was it complete.
So going forward...
No, sorry, I'm sorry. I've been there, Ms. Beattie. I've got the point. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harrison. I'm really grateful. I think in your statement you refer to some of the long hours you and your team were working. They sound like extraordinary times. I mean, working throughout the night on consecutive nights, it must have been really tough for you and your team. So thank you for all that you did to try and ensure that things were improved and to provide good quality data analysis for decision and policy makers. So thank you very much indeed for your help and for what you did during COVID.
Thank you.
Very well. I shall return at 25 to.
All rise.
Ms. Wilson.
My lady, may I please call Mr. James Benford?
Repeat after me, please. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please.
Sorry if we've kept you waiting.
It's okay.
Mr Benford, you are the former director of the economic group within HM Treasury, is that correct?
That's right.
And you've provided a statement to the inquiry dated the 3rd of October 2025 with reference number INQ 000588207. Can you confirm if that statement's true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Thank you. As I understand it, the Treasury uses a group structure to organise its work, with the economics group being one of 13 groups, is that correct?
That's right.
And the core work of the economics group is to provide ministers with analysis and assessment of the macroeconomic picture and developments of the UK economy, is that correct?
That's right.
And it also advises on the implications of the government's economic strategy.
That's right.
To do that, I assume good quality, timely data is crucial.
Yeah.
And you explain in your statement that there were significant challenges with the timeliness of data during the pandemic. Is that correct?
That's right. And it wasn't that the data became less timely, is there was a demand for more timely data.
Yes. Can you provide some examples for us, please?
Yeah, I mean, on that, I should say that the UK data system is actually quite good. We have monthly data on prices, unemployment, GDP, trade. Not all countries have that. But when the pandemic broke out, there was a demand to track things in faster time and also with less of a lag. And that monthly data tends to come out the lag of around a month or so. And given that, there was quite an industry, actually, of looking at real-time indicators like restaurant bookings, flights, and public transport use. What was called mobility data, which is Google data on how many people were located in different types of location, things like that. And that proved very useful for providing a timely indicator on what happens following the pandemic or changing restrictions very quickly.
Can we just break that down? So, as I understand it, traditional sources of data, very effective in normal times, even with a short time lag, but they were put under significant pressure during the pandemic because of the speed at which events were moving. Is that right?
I mean, so those traditional sources of data were still really effective in the pandemic, and in fact, even more useful to be able to track things month by month, which is important because on occasion people have said, why do we need these monthly indicators even now? That they're really important. And so, as I said, it was more that people wanted to know even more quickly,
Yep.
and so there was a scramble to find more information. There was one issue that I should mention, which I don't think I mentioned in my witness statement. It occurred to me just working through for today that there was a decline in the quality of some of the household survey-based indicators, particularly those for the labour market, which I don't think we fully realised at the time. It only became clear with a lag, and that was a problem, actually.
How did that issue with the household data survey impact the work in the Treasury on assessing the macroeconomic picture?
So it was more relevant in the later stages of the pandemic as we were coming out of it, when there was a big issue to do with the number of people who were economically inactive. And the UK was a major outlier relative to other countries, having more people not in work and not seeking work. And that was a feature of the household surveys. And it kind of spurred a big search for why was it that these people weren't working? Was it something to do with their health or other reasons? With the benefit of hindsight, and I don't think we knew this at the time, I think some of that rise in inactivity was probably due to poor quality in the survey data, which was therefore illusory. Not all of it, but some of it was, and that's come to light actually very recently as people have looked at the types of biases that one can get when the number of respondents to the surveys drops to a low level.
And how do you think those challenges can be overcome in a future pandemic?
Well, one really important thing just on those household surveys is maintaining sufficient resources in them. And, you know, there were particular challenges. I mean, this is more from my current role, I should say. I work at the Office for National Statistics now. And there were particular challenges as we came out of the pandemic due to just a general lack of the availability of labour, and that hurt the ONS because they didn't have enough interviewers, and that then had an impact on the survey. Once the ONS responded and put more interviews out there, the quality of the survey recovered, and I think we've learnt from that probably when the number of people responding to that survey dropped, it probably wasn't measuring inactivity fully correctly.
Just going back to a point you mentioned a moment ago about the significant work the Treasury had done to try and obtain novel data sources
Yes.
to improve that real-time data.
Yes.
Do you think there's a benefit in working on that further so that there is better preparedness for a future pandemic?
Definitely. So, I mean, there's a number of parts to that. So I'd say actually those novel data sources came through quite readily, and a number of companies should be congratulated for how willing they were to put them together and help with the demands of the time. And it was really quite broad, not just mobility, but things like card spending data too. One issue in general with those types of data sets can be the need to have robust what's called data pipelines to manage the flows of data, and the initial approaches through the pandemic was really quite ad hoc. It's the case now that many of those data sets have actually proved useful for measuring the economy in normal times as well. And so we work at the ONS, for example, to incorporate those newer big data set methods with traditional statistics to improve those statistics, both their timeliness and also their comprehensiveness. And yeah, that's an area where it's really important to have quite a deliberate, focused strategy.
And as part of any future data strategy, would you agree that building and maintaining and building on those established pipelines is essential?
Yes, I would. I mean, one thing I would just note on that is it is costly to bring data together, and it's costly to maintain those data pipelines so they're of good quality, and there are often, in some cases, restrictions on how data can be moved around and how it can be used that relate to the initial legal ground on which it was collected. That's costly too. So I go through that just to say that this is an area where it's really important to prioritise and really have focused use cases. There can be real dangers if you just try and bring all the data together without being very clear on what you're doing it for and making sure you focus on the most valuable things. And that's an area where I think the National Data Strategy and what's now called the National Data Library has a really important role to play to identify the biggest priorities for enhancing data.
Thank you. Can I now move to ask you about data science capabilities at the Treasury?
Sure.
Firstly, why are such capabilities important in a crisis like a pandemic?
It's essentially because they help you draw conclusions rapidly and efficiently from a wide range of sources, and particularly to be able to deal with very large data sets quickly and effectively. And that's exactly what we needed to do in the pandemic. So
it helps a department be more agile to any fast-developing situation?
More agile, but also more efficient, because you can automate quite a lot of the work you would otherwise need to do manually, which it does allow you to do things more quickly, but it also allows you to do more things.
Thank you. Dr. Tetlow, whose report you've been provided with, observed in her report that the Treasury, on the eve of the pandemic, had very few people employed as data scientists, and she described their capabilities as almost non-existent. Now, you took post in November of 2020. What was your view on the Treasury's capabilities at the time you took office?
So it did have capability. And one thing I was surprised to find, actually, was the Treasury had a quite modern data platform on the cloud, and not many organisations actually had that at that point in time, and some don't even have that today. So it did have that capability, and that's something that's quite hard to set up. So those foundations were there. There was a active coding community with numbers of people working in code to do their work. What was missing was two things. There was no centre of excellence for data science to be a kind of driving force, and there was no strategy for how it be used across the department as a whole. And that's one reason, and perhaps we'll come on to this, why my line manager at the time, Claire Lombardelli, the chief economic advisor, launched a review, I think just after I joined, to establish how the Treasury should grow its data science capabilities.
And what was the result of that review?
So, I should say, I didn't lead that review, but I did closely steer it. It was another member of staff of the Treasury who led that review, but I was given the task of taking forward its recommendations. That the main thing was to establish a data science hub in the Treasury, and also to establish a new role of Chief Data Officer. And so I took forward that. I hired for that Chief Data Officer role and helped that person build up a team. One part was focused on data engineering. That's the pipelines that I talked about, making sure those are effective as possible. Another part was focused on the data science, which is drawing conclusions and insights from that data. The initial vision for the hub was very much a minimum viable product. Which reflects the context. There was a lot of pressure on the Treasury's time. Not just COVID, but we had things like the consequences of Russia invading the Ukraine, and also the department's headcount, and my group's headcount was shrinking. So it was only 12 people that we managed to establish, but it did have a number of important results. So it helped the department more efficiently manage management information, corporate information. The flows of economic data. We built an economic data dashboard. It helped the department to allocate public correspondence to the right place very effectively too. There were a number of important areas where it improved the work of the department.
Could I ask you to slow down? Really grateful. I'm a fine one to talk because I talk very quickly. But
I will do, sorry.
The Data Science Hub, how did the work of that hub contribute to the Treasury's response to the pandemic?
So I don't think it was fully established during the heat of the pandemic. There were data science capabilities more thinly spread that we could draw on. One particular thing that we did that was quite important actually is, particularly during 2020 and the autumn of 2020, there was still uncertainty about the impact of different restrictions. And one unusual feature of the UK was that we had different tiers in place in different parts of the country. And so you could use that information to look at the impact in this region versus another region to work out the impact of those tiers. That's relatively involved because we didn't have GDP data for those different regions, but we did have this mobility data. And so we used several sets of relationships to estimate the impact of tiering on GDP as a whole through those different loops. And we actually published that analysis in the, I think it was the February budget in 2021, and that was an important piece of work to have done.
So you say that the hub wasn't fully stood up during the main part of the pandemic.
Yeah, we were still doing the review in that period.
When was the hub functioning?
We hired. We work out the leadership first. We hired for the Chief Data Officer, I think in 2022, towards the end of that year. So it was quite late, and that reflected the time to do the review, reach conclusions, and change departmental budgets to make room for the hub. So it was quite late.
Thank you. I want to move now to ask you about the production and then the sharing of analysis which is produced within the economics department. As I understand it from your evidence, the analysis is not just produced within the economics department in the Treasury. Is that there are analysts elsewhere? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. There's around, I think, there were around at the time 400 analysts across the Treasury as a whole, and there were policy professionals doing analytical work too. So 400 wasn't the complete picture, I don't think. And the economics group was the biggest part, around 200 of that, but it wasn't the only part.
Now, analysis from the economics group and any other groups in the Treasury was brought together, as I understand it, by the COVID-19 response team, which sat within the strategy planning and budget group led by Dan York-Smith. Is that right?
So we did have a setup where there was a COVID response team focused on policy.
Yes.
And then I had a role in both commissioning and drawing together analysis to feed into that team. But the role in advising specifically on policy was for that team.
I wonder if I could bring up, please, Mr. York Smith's interview as part of a corporate memory project which the Treasury undertook. So INQ 000652 please. Thank you. And this is the last extract of that, where, and I appreciate that these aren't your words, these are Mr. York Smith's words. He states, or it's recorded, sorry, Dan reflected that they got more and more confident about deploying analysis as the crisis continued. There was a cultural thing around economics group waiting to be asked to produce analysis, and this shifted over the course of the pandemic. And I just wondered if you could assist us with what the cultural issue was there around the production of analysis.
So when I started in role, as you often do starting a new role, I did do just a soft review for myself of what people thought of the group, and both externally to the group and within it. And we established a new strategy coming out of that review. And one important leg of that was to be more proactive and to identify, partner with policy teams, identify their needs, and then try and meet their needs proactively rather than wait to be asked. I did listen to the previous hearing too. I do recognise, and I should also say I was new to the civil service through this period. Most of my career has been at the Bank of England before that point, and I did recognise what Rob Harrison described as perhaps a subservience of analysis to policy, and that which gave rise a bit to that waiting to be asked, and sought to address that by being more proactive, both in figuring out and anticipating the needs, but also just taking analytical results and putting them into policy discussions where there was a need to do so that we had identified.
Thank you. Moving on now to what you describe as as a core responsibility of the economics group. Can we look at page 4 of your statement, please? INQ 000588-207. Amongst this is the core objectives, and you describe there one of them is to work collaboratively with colleagues across Treasury, Whitehall and beyond, both to support a shared analysis and assessment of the key macroeconomic issues, but also to ensure those are well communicated and understood. I think we heard from Mr. Harrison this morning that sharing of analysis was essential. Do you share that view?
I do, for two reasons. One, it's only through sharing that you bring different perspectives together, and you'll get a stronger result as a consequence of that. And it's only through sharing that you get the impact that the analysis deserves.
Focusing on economic analysis in particular, is there a benefit to sharing economic analysis with other departments to help them understand the challenges which were faced by the Treasury?
Yes.
What might be the challenges or barriers with sharing of economic analysis?
The main one is it's often intrinsically linked with the discussions around the development of economic policy, and sometimes many of those policy measures, and indeed things like the overall fiscal position of the government, which often flows from the state of the economy, are highly sensitive matters, particularly in the run-up to fiscal events. And one thing that perhaps isn't always appreciated about the pandemic is every major change in restrictions was a fiscal event, because you had to change support to the economy to go with it. And that made things a bit more difficult than they would otherwise have been. Not in all cases. We had very good arrangements for sharing very sensitive information with the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, and shared many long and detailed papers there. And I think they would say that they wouldn't be able to fulfil their role without the work that was provided from the Treasury to them. But we didn't share as freely in real time with others.
What was different about the relationship with the OBR then, who you were able to share freely with, but not some other departments?
Two things I think would be different. One was they were an extremely trusted partner. We knew that none of the information would leak, and then we were very clear about the purpose, how it would be used. It was going to be used in the next fiscal outlook or something like that. So we knew what it was feeding into. I think those two things mark out as a bit different.
Thank you. We've heard from Mr Harrison this morning his perspective that the Treasury cooperated, I think extensively was his word, but also that it was a mixed picture at times. You say in your statement, and I wonder if we could just bring this up please, at page 33, paragraph 100, thank you, that the Treasury stepped up the sharing of analysis as the structures and processes needed to do so became more sophisticated over time. Now, you say stepped up. Is that because you thought there was room for more openness, more sharing of analysis?
I think a few different things happened over time. So as time passed, there was more data available and more analysis could be done. So the available body of analysis to share grew, and so it was quite natural more sharing occurred over time due to that. And then the Cabinet Office set up this new structure, which was there to facilitate information sharing. And I really agreed with what Rob Harrison said about the need to build trust within that structure. And some of this is reflection. I'm not sure I really appreciated the degree at the time, but there really was very, very low levels of trust in some areas at that point. And that
Very low levels of trust in whom or what?
both ways, but particularly through what I would refer to as the health community, health and science community, and the economics community, and which is well documented in the press. And to be completely direct, I had come from the health community. I was working in the Joint Biosecurity Centre before joining the Treasury, and at points I was quite shocked at how people treated me personally differently because I was in a different seat. And at times, I think that went too far, to be honest. I think that reflected that lack of trust, and you can only build trust with time. It takes hard work and a willingness to share. I think we did build that through the period that led up to the publication of the roadmap document, and that's to Rob's great credit. He set up the structures to make that happen. And I would say that, perhaps you would say I would say this, but I think that roadmap document, by a great distance, is one of the best examples I know of collaboration across government to produce a consistent evidence base, and one of the best examples I know of analysis informing policy in a really commendable way.
Given you said you've worked in health teams and then at the Treasury, why do you think there were such low levels of trust during the pandemic between those teams?
Reflecting back, I would put it on the absence of structures to bring the two views together. And that's why the structure which Rob established was so valuable.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe intending to come on to this, but I've heard it kind of asked sometimes, should there have been an economics equivalent of SAGE? SAGE was one quite big, transparent structure to gather scientific evidence. My view on that would be no. We should bring economic voices into SAGE, both to be a member of it and to be part of the leadership of it, because it's only by bringing the two perspectives together you get a stronger understanding, a stronger conclusion and you build that trust. And there weren't enough structures to bring the two groups together.
And I think your view, as you set out in your statement, is that the Directorate General for Analysis would have been useful if it had been set up earlier. You're very much in favour of that structure.
100%, and I think it's important. It's not just a kind of break glass in emergency that set this up in a
Yes.
crisis all times, because you need the relationships, you need the trust to be there from the start. If you try and do it just in the heat of the moment, it's really hard to do that because
Yeah.
the tensions and the stakes are too high.
It comes back to what you said a moment ago. Trust has to be built over time, and that's in normal times, and then is effectively tested
Yes.
in an emergency like a pandemic
Yes.
or a future crises. Thank you. I just want to ask you about one reflection of Mr Harrison set in his statement and this morning, was that the Treasury found transparency uncomfortable, and that's against that background of a mixed picture of engagement. From your perspective, did it?
I mean, I think on this it's quite hard to, with any organisation, to describe it as this uniform, slightly faceless body, right? There's different parts of the Treasury, and I know yourselves, and I agree with this, have commended really strong ways of working between the Treasury and His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and that's true from what I saw. So often, it depended on the strengths of relationships. I did read Rob Harrison's statements and the sense that he picked up from others that perhaps with respect to economic analysis, there was a bit of a scarring effect after the publication of various pieces of work on Brexit, on the sharing of economic analysis, because of the view that they had been sometimes almost weaponised and quoted out of context. I think I did detect that.
Thank you. I just want to look at a couple of examples with you, please. One is one which we touched on this morning, the toy model.
Yeah.
Which, as I understand it, was a very simplistic model
Yeah.
to be used by analysts to gain a feel of outcomes of the virus, including transmission and how vaccines might affect things
Yeah.
like hospital admissions. But its purpose was not to replace the more extensive, formal, complex models owned by SPI-M.
Yeah.
Were you aware of the model's use within the Treasury when you were in post?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not completely sure whether I would have seen all of its use, because some of its use was outside my group, but I was aware of it. And I should also say on this that I encouraged the Treasury to collaborate with the Joint Biosecurity Centre to develop that model, and we did actively develop it, both at the outset and to include an extension of the model to account for different variants of the virus, because I thought it would be extremely useful to have a simple model to basically be a place where we could get to a common understanding of important factors that were under consideration.
So after it had been distributed amongst analysis, the Treasury did extend the model, but you thought for good reason.
So this bit is relatively complex. So a few different things were going on at the same time, and there were different types of extensions. So
I don't think we need to get into the detail of it, but let me just put a document on
Sure.
screen and see.
Yeah.
So can we have, please, the statement of Mr Harrison?
Yeah.
INQ 000656298, paragraph 109. Page 33, please. I just want to put this perspective to you, Mr Benford. His recollection was that it became clear that the Treasury had adapted and built out the JBC model to show numerical outputs over a long period of time,
Yeah.
without consultation with other stakeholders. So rather than the details of how it was extended,
Yeah.
was it extended without consultation with other stakeholders?
So I now know which extension you're referring to. There was a second extension too. There's a few things to say here. So this was in January 2021, and what the Treasury was trying to do at the moment was to plan the kind of outlook for economic policy over the coming years, and to do that needed to have a baseline view of where the virus was heading over a long period. That JBC model had initially only been set up for a short time period, so that's the context. Another piece of context, and you did get into this with Rob this morning too, is the Treasury had another model. It had this quite simple, crude epi-macro model that we had available too, and we had used that in December and put together some general advice for the Chancellor based on that model rather than the JBC model, and the conclusions we were careful to caveat and to keep qualitative because I wasn't comfortable with the strength of that model, particularly the economic side, actually.
Okay.
And so what happened, and this was the deliberate strategy, was we used that model and the JBC model to try and encourage the rest of the community to commission modelling over a longer time period, because without that we couldn't form a sensible framing for economic policy going forward.
Just on the the epi-macro model.
Yes.
You didn't share that model with Rob Harrison's
No.
team, did you?
No.
Looking back, do you think it would have been beneficial to share that?
I'm not sure. So it was so when I joined the Treasury in November 2020, the model had been developed in the summer. There was an established departmental position not to share it.
Who would have made that decision?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I accepted that. The logic to that, and I think it does relate back to the experience during the Brexit period, is we weren't very we weren't very confident in the strength of that modelling, and we were nervous that Treasury having this model could get into a reaction, a disproportionate reaction that would be a big distraction, basically. And so our strategy instead was to build a joint model with the rest of the community and to focus on that and to transition off that very crude epi-macro model to the one that you described, and that's what we did.
So was it then that the previous public criticism about the analysis the Treasury had undertaken had created a more guarded approach to sharing and openness?
I don't know. I mean, so whenever that position was established, it was before I joined, I just accepted it. So I would be speculating, I think.
Going back to the toy model briefly, were you aware of some nervousness about the use of that model at the time? Because if it's stretched too much or if it's used in the wrong way, then you lose the model, don't you? It could be taken away from everybody.
Well, I'm not sure it's taken away from everybody. It's more that, when something isn't robust, and I really subscribe to the view that Rob mentioned too, that it shouldn't just be one model, it should be several. It's not load-bearing. You shouldn't be basing a policy conclusion on it. So that's why there was a view, which we supported, that we should be basing the final policy conclusions on the SPI-M modelling, which was more robust and extensive. What the simple toy model was very useful for is understanding the impact of different parameters. And one parameter that was very important that was shown both in that toy modelling and in the SPI-M modelling, for example, was the starting value of R, whether infections going into a decision on what to do with restrictions were increasing or decreasing. And the joint model we had available was very useful in illustrating that point. And it was very useful also in making sure we did have the correct starting value for that parameter.
But a number amongst the analytical community perhaps are a bit surprised and a bit upset at the way the Treasury had used the model. And if I could just ask for one document to be put on screen, please. INQ 0001966028, page 1. And this was an email from Anjan McLean, who'd been part of the team to set up the model, to Robert Harrison. She's saying there, HMT changed the model after I'd QA'd, quality assured it, and I don't know how. And we can see there the strength of her view in the following lines. Looking back, and given the sense of feeling that the Treasury had done this without consultation with people like Robert and Harrison, do you think that the Treasury could have been more open and transparent about how it had extended or adapted the toy model?
So, I mean, I think it's important to remember, and you can see it in some of the language in this email, that we were operating in a low trust environment.
Yes.
And what was a relatively understandable need from one perspective, from another perspective was quite a big surprise. So we need to know what would happen over a long time horizon. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to put together that budget in February and have a sensible basis for working through economic policy. We did reveal that to the community, and I can remember a meeting where I talked through it and got from a number of people what felt like quite violent reactions. And we did work through that, and we agreed a basis for a way forward. And we got to a very good place, which was we would develop a shared commission for the more robust modelling. And
was the outcome of that, I think it was led by Mr. Harrison, wasn't it? And the Directorate of Analysis team to bring together the different perspectives and work through it for a constructive solution.
Well, the outcome I remember at that point in time was to agree this joint commission that went to SPI-M.
Yes.
And that produced the more robust modelling, which in the end got us to what was a great roadmap document. It's quite hard to replay it almost 5 years afterwards. We got to the right place. It was bumpy. And if we'd had a kind of higher trust environment, it wouldn't have been so bumpy. But yeah, it's quite hard to know if a different approach could have got us there more smoothly. I think a lot was to do with the low trust environment.
Can I ask you very briefly about another example? Can we agree that sourcing and referencing analysis is best practice? I think it's set out in the Aqua Book.
Yeah.
And that the purpose of that is to ensure that analysis is fully auditable and it's clear who owns the primary analysis. Is that correct?
Yeah.
We touched briefly this morning on an example around analysis on the impact of workforce absences.
Yeah.
There was some concern about the Treasury asking for that analysis not to be attributed to them, but rather it to be labelled as government internal analysis.
Yeah.
I think this occurred at a time when you were taking a period of leave for reasons which we don't need to go into.
Yeah.
But can you help us with why that approach might have been taken?
I don't think I can, to be honest.
Okay.
I wasn't there. Context is always important. And I don't know what happened. When I got back, which was February 2022, after Omicron had, the community moved past that, I was aware that something had happened. I didn't dig into it because we quite quickly moved on to the next thing, which was, concerns, I think, around that time about Russia invading Ukraine. So I don't know.
Did it represent a departmental position about not labelling analysis as Treasury analysis?
I don't think so. I wasn't aware of that position.
I want to ask you finally, briefly, about the Treasury's engagement with external experts.
Yeah.
As I understand it, there were some talks and presentations given by external experts, but there was no formal forum for testing ideas, receiving constructive feedback on those ideas with experts. Is that right?
So we didn't have the Council of Economic Advisors in operation. We did set up seminars ourselves, and we sometimes used a group which emerged during this period called the Economics Observatory to set up forums on our behalf. But one thing that had existed at other times as Council of Economic Advisors was not there.
Can you just briefly provide an overview of what the Council of Economic Advisors is?
Yes. So, I mean, the form of that council has changed at different points. So it's not been fixed. I think it was first established by Gordon Brown. And generally, the model was that there's someone who chairs the council. Often, the special political advisor in the Chancellor's office with the most senior position, the Chief of Staff, and then they brought together both academics and economists operating in the market to discuss issues of the day. Should say it's quite a tricky setup to make work, because you can't give these people access to privileged information, and you can't give them a privileged position. That wouldn't be right. And so generally, the matters for discussion have been quite general rather than specific areas of policy, and they've been minuted with clear agendas and so on, so that everything is transparent.
I think there was some attempt to set up that structure during the pandemic.
Yes.
I understand the Chancellor was in favour of that. Is that correct?
So I remember loosely that we did put a piece of advice up to suggest how it could be set up, referencing what had been done in the past. And I think that was in early 2021, but it never happened. As for exactly why, I don't know.
Do you think that sort of structure would be helpful in a future crisis?
Well, so on that, it's important to remember that that kind of structure isn't the only source of independent advice for the Chancellor or the Treasury. There's the Bank of England,
yes,
and there's the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, and that they were often sought as other ways of getting independent advice from views inside the Treasury. I don't think the role of that group is just for crises. It's more general than that, and it does help bring a broader range of views outside the system. So a challenge to groupthink, if you like. So it does have that value. But as I touched on before, there is real value in bringing different perspectives together, not just from economists, but from scientists too. And I could see value from having a stronger voice from economists on a group like SAGE, just to make sure that perspectives are brought together and trust is built across the two communities.
Thank you, Mr. Benford. Those are all my questions, but I understand there are some from core participants.
There are, Ms Wilson. Thank you very much. Ms Beattie, who sits just there.
Thank you, Melanie. Mr. Benford, I ask questions on behalf of National Disabled People's Organisations. You explain in your statement that your core responsibilities in the pandemic included working collaboratively with colleagues across government, the HMT, Whitehall and beyond, to support a shared analysis and assessment of key macroeconomic issues. And that included collaboration in HMT and engagement with analytical colleagues across the Government Economic Service, Director of Analysis Networks, as well as the Bank of England and the OBR, and with externals. And you mentioned UK think tanks, commentators and academics, and international bodies such as the OECD and IMF. Did that include any collaboration with civil society groups?
So I wasn't personally involved in such collaboration. Now, other areas of the Treasury might have been, and I should say the Treasury had a general role to monitor the impact of policies on different groups, and that role was actually located in a different part of the Treasury. So it may be that part of the Treasury had more of those links, but I didn't have them personally. It was quite relevant to a number of pieces of economic work to know about the impact on different groups, and we did do some formal analysis at different points in time. For example, working through whether schemes like the furlough scheme benefited different groups differently. On disability, there was no evidence of any difference from the study that I was aware of.
I mean, I think you explain in your statement that kind of macroeconomic work covered things like the labour market,
Yes.
so, for example, furlough,
Yes.
or even broader analysis like the cost of living.
Yes.
And so would it be right, you've used the term load-bearing in an answer to an earlier
Yes.
question. Would some of that analysis have been more load-bearing and brought in, if it had brought in and those other potential sources of information and data from civil society organisations, be they representative organisations of disabled people or otherwise?
I mean, in general, more source of information, more views, the better. So yeah, yes. I wasn't directly involved in that analysis. I was a consumer of it, so I don't know about how the links work with that area and those groups. But I can see value in those links existing, definitely.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Beattie. Ms Hannett, who's just behind.
Thank you, my lady. Ms Benford, I appear on behalf of the long COVID group.
Yes.
Can I ask you first, did the economics group carry out any assessment or analysis of the number of people who were economically inactive or whose ability to work was restricted by long COVID?
So this was an important area, and one general question during the pandemic was what was the long-term impact and what's the long-term, what's called a scarring impact on the economy, including through the labour market. And there was that area we touched on before in terms of a rise in activity. And I have looked back at some of my notes on this, and I remember that rise in activity being driven in terms of that rise for health reasons, but by two different cohorts. One was mental health issues in the young, which tended to grow over time. And there was an older cohort who had a broader range, often physical issues. Within that, we did do some work, or we drew on analysis of the impact of low COVID specifically. When I went back to look at it, one particularly important study was an ONS survey in July 2022, which found around 27,000 people might be inactive due to long COVID. And to put that in perspective, the rise in inactivity at that point was measured to be
Mr. Benford, sorry, I don't mean to cut across you, but I've got very limited time. Can I ask whether the economics group, I want to confine your answer to my question, if you may.
Sure.
Did your group do any analysis on the effect of long COVID?
We would have synthesised the available evidence
Into what?
to develop a view of the longer term impacts of COVID and the pandemic more broadly on scarring and the increase in activity in the labour market. And that survey suggested to us in 2022, July 2022, that the impacts were quite small. That was the last piece of work that I've managed to find that was done specific to long COVID during the period I was there at the Treasury.
Can I ask, is that understanding formulated in any formal document that can be provided to the inquiry? With my lady's leave, of course.
It's possible. So that ONS survey is in the public domain.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm asking about your analysis, your group's analysis of that, whether that...
We can go and look.
Well, with my lady's leave,
I'm not there
very
anymore,
grateful.
but I'm sure we can go and look.
And my second question, Mr. Benford, thank you, is are you able to make any recommendations as to how data can be gathered on the number of individuals who can't work or whose productivity is curtailed due to suffering from the long-term sequelae of a novel virus in a future pandemic?
Right. Yes. And it'd be good to get on to some other recommendations if there's time. One really important area is the linking of different data sets. And as we were trying to work out what was driving that rise of inactivity that we talked about, we identified basically 3 areas of data in the health system, the benefit system, and the payroll system that, if you like, could provide a lot of information on the impact of different health conditions. And we did have, just as I was leaving the Treasury, a discussion with people like Sir Chris Whitty and Sir Ian Diamond to set something up in that space. And I was very pleased to find when I joined the ONS that work on that data linkage had actually come to fruition, and a number of important papers had been published from it. That area is a really important area as a basis for policy making. It's not clear that it necessarily needs to be done within the ONS, but it's important that those linked data sets are made available. There are costs in doing so, you need to prioritise, but it's an important area.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms Benford. Thank you, Melody.
Thank you, Ms Hannett. I think that completes the questions that we have for you. Thank you very much indeed for your help, Ms Benford. I hope you enjoy the new job. Oh, you want to say something?
If that's okay, because
Yes, of course.
I was hoping to have the same chance that Rob did to just make an observation
I'm
on...
sorry if we deprived you.
I thought his group was excellent, and it's a model that should be codified. Just to build on what he said, there's a particularly important group of individuals between the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Scientific Advisor, Chief Economic Analysis, and the National Statistician, which I think could sit over a group like that and be a really good basis for building trust and collaboration. On the sharing of Treasury information, looking back, I do think it would be possible to go further than happened. And as I mentioned, there's very detailed sharing that goes between the Treasury and the OBR in preparation for a budget. And there's very good reasons that can't be shared at the time. But one thing that could be considered is whether some of it could be made available afterwards. I think if people saw that, then some of the suspicions about the Treasury would be reduced. And I also agree with Rob about the benefits of codifying information sharing and how that should work, although, of course, that would need ministerial agreement.
Thank you very much indeed. And to the poor soul that you've delegated the task of finding that analysis, if they'd like to wait until we see what the inquiry says we need, they needn't go off and do it just yet. Thank you very much indeed for all the help.
Thank you.
Very well, I shall return. I think the next witness is not available yet, and so I shall return at 1:30.